calling upon the governor to convene a special session of the South Dakota legislature to deal with this issue. And second, I'm calling on Lieutenant Governor Daugaard to finally acknowledge that we have a budget crisis in South Dakota and to join me in taking the lead in dealing with this problem immediately instead of waiting until January. So where are we as a state? Well, here's where we are. Over the last 8 years, this administration has increased spending by 53%. They have hired a new state employee every 48 hours. They have given the next governor an annual deficit of $107 million, fully between 9 and 10% of the entire revenue stream for the state of South Dakota in just one annual deficit to grapple with. But let's go back in time and look at the chronology of events that has led us to today, and specifically to the governor's announcement yesterday. During the legislative session in March, David Knudsen and I, the two leaders of the state senate, reached an agreement on 80 to 90% of the ways in which to balance the budget. These were bipartisan cuts, solutions to the budget problem that we faced. Notice that it included a repeal of tax breaks for TransCanada. That would save us $10.5 million that we're going to be hemorrhaging out of the Treasury this year. Second, across-the-board cuts. This was later changed from $7 million to between $10 and $20 million. That was Senator Knudsen's estimate of a reduction in the size of government between 2 and 3%. And then just the third one I'll point out are the phantom FTEs, $5 million. You remember, those are positions that the administration asks the legislature to fund. We fund, and they don't hire someone for the position. Instead, the dollars become a part of something called salary salvage, and they're used for other purposes other than the purpose for which they were asked for from the legislature. So, Senator Knudsen and I come together and we reach an agreement about these bipartisan cuts. And I want to just focus on 3 of them because that's what I'm asking for the special session to be about. The TransCanada tax break, across-the-board reduction in government, and the phantom FTEs. We reached that agreement in March of this year, just 6 months ago. And what was the response of the administration? The response was this: no reduction in across-the-board spending or phantom FTEs, and instead of eliminating the TransCanada tax break, they decided to reduce it by 50%, but to maintain it, so that we'll pay $10.5 million for TransCanada for a pipeline project and an incentive they never sought, one in which North Dakota didn't pay, one in which Nebraska didn't pay, but for some reason South Dakota felt the need to pay TransCanada $10.5 million. Okay, fine. That was their response. No reduction in the size of government. Then we begin the politics after the session. And what does the Lieutenant Governor say? The Lieutenant Governor writes a letter on April 14, 2010. You've seen this before. There is no budget crisis in South Dakota. No budget crisis as of April 14th. Then we opened the papers yesterday, and what do we see? We see not only that the Governor of South Dakota has asked every agency and department and office to present a plan for the reduction of government by 10%, but we know they've been working on it all summer, because the deadline to report was September 1. Agencies don't do this overnight. So one wonders whether at the time this letter was written, they already knew that state government was going to have to be reduced by 10% or thereabouts to balance the budget. I don't know when they started the process. All I know is that in yesterday's paper, they announced that most of state government was supposed to respond by September 1, and I believe the judicial system was given until October 1. There wasn't any press conference called by the governor or the administration to make it clear that they were going through this process. I didn't know about it until I opened the paper yesterday or the day before when it was on the wire service. I knew nothing about these plans. But now that the governor has joined us in recognizing the crisis that we face in South Dakota, let's deal with it. Instead of putting it under the rug for another 4 or 5 or 6 months, let's take care of it now. Under the Constitution in South Dakota, a special session can be called in one of 2 ways. The legislature can call it if there are 2/3 of both houses that petition the governor, but clearly the easiest and cleanest way is for the administration to simply call a special session, and the only requirement of the law is that you identify the purposes of the special session. So I've written a letter and I've given you all a copy of it, and I've suggested just 3 purposes. 1, reduce the size of government, not by 10%, but at least by 2 or 3% so we can get started on this problem, as Senator Knudsen and I suggested in March. 2, phantom FTEs, the growth of FTEs. This is really a transparency in government issue, a truth in budgeting issue. Let's eliminate the cushion that is in so many of the budgets in state government. We estimate that that number is $4 to $5 million. And 3, the TransCanada subsidy, which was never needed or requested by TransCanada, wasn't replicated by North Dakota or Nebraska. It's just an example of South Dakota hemorrhaging dollars out of the Treasury for a pipeline project that was going to take the shortest route between A and B in any event. Those are the 3 things that I would like us to deal with. We can deal with them in a day. The last time I checked with the LRC, the estimate is $45,000 a day to call a special session. We can take care of $45,000 in any one of these savings. And if the governor and the lieutenant governor want to continue in flying their airplanes until January, that's fine with me. We don't have to deal with that in a special session. We'll deal with it when I take office. But honestly, if we can't show enough leadership to deal with this problem now, why would we wait until January? All this requires is a political will to step forward, show the leadership to deal with the problem we know now exists. We've reached a consensus. The problem exists. Let's not ignore it. We can't ignore it. We have to deal with it. I'm proposing a way in which to do that through a special session of the South Dakota legislature. It's not as monumental as it sounds. It's getting 105 regular South Dakotans together in Pierre with a proposal to reduce the size of government starting now, to reduce phantom FTEs starting now, to end the hemorrhaging of the budget for TransCanada starting now, and then we can reconvene in January and take another look at reducing the size of government even further. The people of South Dakota expect this from leaders. This is our opportunity to show leadership. I invite Dennis Daugaard and Mike Rounds to join me in that effort. I'd be glad to take any questions that you have.
Wasn't Rounds basing his plan, though, on the fact on losing federal stimulus dollars next year? So it's something that's more farther down the road, it's something that would necessarily need immediate attention?
Well, Perry, I think even this administration would acknowledge that there is a deficit going forward. The Lieutenant Governor and I in the debates have disagreed about the extent of it. The Budget Office during the last session used the figure $107 million, which is between 9 and 10% of our revenue stream. The Lieutenant Governor says it's not that big, it's more like between $85 and $90 million. But it's a real problem. And yes, it is caused by the fact that in this budget year, in part, in this budget year, we will not have federal stimulus dollars, but it's real because it represents the difference between our expected revenue and our expected expenditures. So we have to deal with it. Better to do it now than to wait until then.
State agencies will tell you that they've been asked to do this exercise of cutting their budget 5, 10, even as much as 15% every year for the last 4 or 5 years, and that this is just another one of those exercises. Just have ready. They've never had to do that, but it was just something for every agency to think about.
If that's the case, it's news to me, and I've been the leader in the Senate for the last 4 years and tried to stay in pretty close touch with the agencies about what's going on. I think there is a new sense of urgency this year. As an example, the structural deficit, and as most folks know in South Dakota, we've faced structural deficits in 7 of the last 8 years, which means simply that we've taken in less money than we've spent. Well, the structural deficit for the 09-10 budget cycle, $8 million. This year, 107, or 85, or $90 million. That's the size of the problem compared to the previous year. That's why I think there's a new sense of urgency and why we have urged from the beginning that we take this seriously and we do something about it instead of living in denial and pretending that there's no budget crisis. I don't think anybody believes that anymore. I don't even think Dennis believes that anymore. The question is what we're going to do about this crisis.
If the governor says no to the special session, are you going to take steps to have the 2/3 vote?
I don't know how I could possibly get that without substantial help from the Republicans. I will tell you that I've talked to at least one Republican legislator who yesterday was as upset as I was to learn that these were the plans going on at the same time the administration came forward with a budget that really didn't reduce the size of government or phantom FTEs or TransCanada payments except by half. So I imagine there would be some support. Whether there'd be 2/3, I don't know, but I think it's probably worth looking